soft, velvet-lined box sat on my vanity, a silent, waiting trap. Inside, nestled like twin jewels, were the custom-made contact lenses. Their color was a swirling nebula of deep violet and electric blue, the exact shade of my irises. A genetic quirk I'd inherited from my mother, and the one feature my stepsister Chloe had always coveted with a venomous, all-consuming jealousy. I watched her reflection in the mirror of my closet door as she slipped into my room, her movements practiced and sly. The quiet click of her door failing to close properly, a familiar sound of impending theft. She thought I was in the shower, the water I'd turned on a few minutes ago providing the perfect auditory cover. But I was standing in the shadows of my walk-in closet, the fabric of my simple black prom dress cool against my skin, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm of retribution. Chloe's eyes, a standard pretty blue, scanned my room with a proprietary air. They landed on the vanity, and her lips, painted a garish shade of fuchsia, curled into a triumphant little smirk. This was it. The final, crucial piece of a plan I had spent a year meticulously constructing, a year of biting my tongue until it nearly bled, of playing the part of the docile, forgettable stepdaughter, the gray background against which she could shine her brightest. Tonight was prom, and for the second time in my existence, Chloe was about to ruin it. Only this time, the ruin would be entirely, spectacularly her own. She moved with the unearned confidence of a princess, her silver gown rustling as she sat on my vanity stool. It was a one-of-a-kind couture piece, a waterfall of shimmering silk and crystals that had cost more than my first car. The same dress she had all but blackmailed my father into buying for her. The same dress I had cleverly, secretly purchased months before she even knew of its existence, only to sell it to her at an extortionate markup. She saw the box, and her smirk widened. She had seen me wear the contacts once, a calculated move on my part, and the envy that had flashed in her eyes was so potent it was almost tangible. She couldn't stand for me to have one single thing that outshone her, especially not tonight. She carefully plucked the delicate lenses from their case and, with the practiced ease of someone who had been stealing my belongings for a decade, placed them in her eyes. It was a ritual I had seen her perform with my sweaters, my jewelry, my very ideas. She blinked a few times, turning to the large mirror, and let out a soft, delighted gasp. My eyes stared back at her from her own face. The effect was, I had to admit, stunning. The violet blue transformed her from merely pretty into something ethereal, otherworldly. It was the final touch to her carefully constructed image of perfection. The designer gown, the diamond necklace that had once belonged to my mother, twinkling at her throat, and now, the eyes that had always been my only claim to beauty in our vapid, cruel household. As she scurried out of my room, a thief in the night clad in silver, I stepped out of the darkness, a cold, serene smile, touching my own lips. I walked over to the vanity and looked at my own reflection. My eyes, the real ones, seemed to look back at me with a knowing glint. Chloe had no idea that the contacts were a Trojan horse. She was blissfully unaware that the beautiful violet blue pigment was suspended in a complex protein-based saline solution I had spent hundreds of hours perfecting in the school chemistry lab, a solution that would remain perfectly stable for precisely 3 hours in a warm, humid environment before breaking down catastrophically. When it did, the hyper-concentrated, non-toxic cosmetic dye would liquefy and stream from her eyes in thick, dark rivulets. She wanted my eyes? Tonight, in front of the entire school, in front of the wealthy, influential parents our family so desperately wanted to impress, she could have them, and everything that came with them. In my first life, I hadn't been so clever. I had been a leaf in a storm, tossed about by the whims of others until I was finally torn from the branch. I had been a victim, plain and simple, a textbook case of Cinderella without the fairy godmother. My own mother, the source of all the light and warmth in my early years, was stolen from me by a brain aneurysm when I was 8. One day she was there, her laughter filling every corner of our sunny home. The next, she was gone, and my world, once a vibrant tapestry of color, turned a uniform, suffocating gray. My father, Richard, was a man who defined himself by the woman on his arm. He was handsome, charming, and utterly terrified of being alone, of being seen as incomplete. The grief that should have bonded us instead became a chasm between us. He looked at me and saw my mother's eyes, and the sight was too painful for him to bear. So, he looked away. A year after my mother's funeral, a year I spent in a haze of quiet sorrow, he married Evelyn. She was a widow with a daughter of her own, Chloe, who was exactly my age. They moved into our house, my mother's house, filled with my mother's things. And from the moment their designer luggage crossed the threshold, I became an inconvenience, a ghost haunting the memory of a happier time he was desperate to pave over. The abuse wasn't overt at first, not the kind that leaves visible bruises. It was a more insidious campaign, a war of 1,000 tiny cuts designed to bleed my spirit dry. Evelyn, with her perfectly manicured nails and saccharine smile, was the general. She'd accidentally shrink my favorite sweaters in the wash, the precious few my mother had knitted for me, her apology dripping with a sweetness that couldn't mask the glint of triumph in her eyes. My homework, meticulously completed, would go missing from my backpack right before it was due, resulting in lectures from teachers about responsibility. Chloe, a perfect little soldier, would steal my art projects, my essay ideas, my very thoughts, and present them as her own. She'd stand beside my father, basking in his praise for a concept she'd lifted from my diary, while I stood silently by, the words of protest dying in my throat because I knew no one would believe me. My father, blinded by Evelyn's cloying affection and Chloe's manufactured charm, saw none of it. Or perhaps he simply chose not to see. It was easier that way. When I did summon the courage to speak, to point out a lie or an injustice, I was met with tired sighs and weary lectures about my attitude. "You're being so difficult, Anna," he would say, rubbing his temples. "Evelyn is trying so hard. Chloe just wants to be your sister. Why can't you just be more like her? Why can't you be happy?" That question, "Why can't you be more like Chloe?" became the soundtrack to my adolescence, a constant grinding reminder of my own inadequacy in his eyes. They were a team, a united front in their mission to erode and erase me. I was the drab brown sparrow to Chloe's brilliant bird of paradise, and they made sure I never forgot it. My college fund, a substantial trust my mother had established for me at birth, was their personal slush fund. It was systematically drained to pay for Chloe's equestrian lessons at a private stable, her annual ski trips to Aspen with her friends, and a wardrobe that could rival a Hollywood starlet's. I once found a receipt for a single pair of Chloe's shoes that cost more than I made in 2 months. Meanwhile, I was told to get a part-time job at the local diner if I wanted new clothes for school. I'd come home late at night, the smell of grease and stale coffee clinging to my hair and uniform, to find them watching a movie on the giant flat-screen TV they'd bought with my inheritance. They reveled in the inequality, in the quiet, crushing cruelty of it all. It wasn't just about elevating Chloe, it was about diminishing me. The senior prom in that first life was their Sistine Chapel of sadism, a masterpiece of psychological torture. I'd saved every penny from my diner job for 6 agonizing months to buy a simple but elegant navy blue dress. It wasn't couture, it wasn't flashy, but when I tried it on, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. I felt almost beautiful. The day of the prom, I came home from my final shift, my meager savings account officially empty, to find Evelyn and Chloe in the laundry room. A sickly sweet chemical smell of bleach hung heavy in the air. My dress was in a heap on the floor, a mangled sacrifice to their jealousy, covered in white, corrosive splotches that had eaten through the delicate fabric. "Oh, darling, it was a terrible, terrible accident," Evelyn had cooed, rushing forward to put an arm around me. Her eyes, however, gleamed with an insincere sympathy that made my stomach turn. "Chloe was just trying to be helpful and do a load of whites, and the bottle slipped right out of her hands, didn't it, sweetie?" Chloe, standing behind her mother, was biting her lip, but I could see the laughter dancing in her eyes. She nodded meekly. They presented me with my replacement, with great fanfare. A frilly, mustard yellow monstrosity with enormous puffed sleeves that had belonged to Evelyn in the 1980s. It was their victory lap, a final, definitive statement. I was a joke, but that wasn't even the worst of it. Mark, the boy I had a devastating, all-consuming crush on, the one who had so charmingly asked me to prom, never showed up. I waited for an hour in that hideous yellow dress, my corsage wilting on my wrist, my heart sinking with every passing minute until it was a cold, hard stone in my chest. Later that night, scrolling through social media with trembling fingers, I saw the pictures. There was Mark, his arm wrapped tightly around Chloe's waist, his smile wide and genuine. She was wearing a breathtaking red gown that shimmered under the lights. The caption on her photo read, "Best prom with the best date a girl could ask for." I later found out from a sympathetic friend that he'd asked me out as a prank, a cruel joke they had cooked up together in the school cafeteria. The public humiliation was a physical force, a wave that knocked me down and held me under until I couldn't breathe. I didn't just feel sad, I felt annihilated. The true breaking point, the event that literally ended my life, came a year later. My eyes, the one unique thing about me they couldn't take or tarnish, became my death sentence. A renowned fashion photographer was visiting our town, scouting for fresh faces. He saw a candid photo of me a friend had posted online from a school event. He was captivated by the unique, deep, violet blue color of my eyes and contacted me directly, offering a test shoot in his New York studio. He said I had a look he'd been searching for, that it could lead to a real modeling contract. It was a life raft tossed into the churning sea of my despair. A tangible, shimmering chance to escape my personal hell and build a life of my own. When Evelyn and Chloe found out, their reaction was terrifying. Chloe's jealousy, usually a simmering pot of resentment, boiled over into something monstrous and raw. Evelyn's manipulative cruelty escalated into incandescent fury. How dare I, the plain, unworthy stepdaughter, be given an opportunity that should have belonged to her perfect, beautiful Chloe? How dare I have a path to a life more glamorous than the one they had planned for themselves? The morning of the shoot, as I was about to leave for the airport, they cornered me at the top of our grand, winding staircase. Evelyn grabbed my portfolio from my hands, her fingers digging into the leather. "You are not going anywhere," she hissed, her face a mask of cold fury. "You will not embarrass this family by running off to become some cheap little model." Chloe blocked my path, her body rigid with rage. "You think you're so special with those freakish eyes," she spat, her voice laced with years of pent-up venom. "You don't deserve this. I deserve it." I tried to push past them, my hands shaking, a desperate plea rising in my throat. "It's my life. You can't control me anymore." I reached for my portfolio, and in the ensuing struggle, Evelyn shoved me. Hard. It wasn't an accident. In the split second before I fell, I saw the cold, deliberate intent in her eyes. It was a calculated act of violence. I lost my balance, my feet tangling in the plush runner. My last sensation was the sickening, weightless lurch of the fall, the world tumbling in a dizzying blur of ornate banisters and ancestral portraits. My final sight, seared into my memory, was of Chloe's face at the top of the stairs, her lips twisted into a victorious, triumphant smirk as the world fractured and went black. Then, impossibly, I was awake. Not in a hospital, not in a sterile, white afterlife, but in my own bed. Sunlight streamed through my window, the same annoying sliver of light that always hit my pillow at 7 a.m. I looked at my hands. They were unscarred, younger. My phone on the nightstand showed the date, August 14th, the first day of my junior year, exactly 2 years before my death. The memories of the next 2 years flooded my mind in a terrifying, crystal-clear torrent. Every slight, every lie, every stolen dollar, the ruined prom dress, the final, fatal push. The terror was overwhelming, a tidal wave of remembered pain and helplessness. I curled into a ball beneath my covers, my body shaking with silent, racking sobs. It wasn't a dream. It was real. I had died. And now, somehow, I was back. But as the hours passed and the initial shock subsided, something else took its place. Something cold and hard and heavy began to form in the pit of my stomach. A feeling I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years, a feeling I had been conditioned to suppress. Rage. Pure, Arctic cold, diamond-hard rage. They had taken everything from me. My home, my father's love, my inheritance, my future, my very life. But in their ultimate act of cruelty, they had made a fatal error. They had given me a second chance. And this time, I wouldn't be the victim cowering in the shadows. This time, I would be the architect of their downfall. I would be the karma they never saw coming. The first few weeks of my new life were an exercise in supreme self-control. I had to relearn how to live with them, how to navigate the minefield of our home without betraying the knowledge I now possessed. I had to smile blandly at Evelyn's backhanded compliments. "That color is so brave on you, Anna," and ignore Chloe's petty provocations as she borrowed my things. In my first life, their words and actions had been daggers to my heart. Now they were just data points, evidence I collected and filed away. I was an anthropologist studying a primitive, vicious tribe, observing their rituals of cruelty with a chilling detachment. My grief for the father I had once loved was replaced by a final, bitter acceptance. He wasn't a hapless victim of Evelyn's manipulation. He was a willing accomplice, a man who had consciously chosen a life of easy comfort and superficial beauty over the well-being of his own daughter. My tears for him, shed over years of loneliness, finally dried up forever. The decision to fight back wasn't a single dramatic moment of revelation. It was a slow, hardening resolve that settled deep in my bones, reinforcing my spine with steel. They had worshipped at the altar of status, beauty, and money. It was only fitting that I use those very things to utterly dismantle them. And the stage for my grand finale, the culmination of my 2-year revenge plot, would be the one I had once dreaded more than anything, the senior prom. My plan began with small, deliberate, and secret steps. I used my flawless foreknowledge of the stock market. I remembered a small, obscure tech startup that had been mentioned in passing on the news in my first life, a company that had skyrocketed in value overnight. I took the meager savings from my diner job, money I earned all over again, and invested every penny. The fear of it being a fluke, a misremembered detail, was intense, but the gamble paid off. Within 6 months, I had quietly amassed a small fortune, which I tucked away in a private bank account under my own name, an account my family knew nothing about. I stopped being the mousy, sullen girl they expected. I feigned a newfound, passionate interest in my studies, particularly in chemistry. Mr. Harrison, the chemistry teacher, was a kind, passionate educator who had been perpetually disappointed by my lackluster performance in my first life. This time, I became his star pupil. I devoured textbooks, I stayed late after school. My questions became more insightful and complex. I spent my lunches and free periods in the lab running experiments. I told him I was working on a highly ambitious project for the state science fair, a study on the stability of organic cosmetic dyes in various protein-based hydrogel solutions. He was beyond thrilled and gave me unfettered access to the lab's resources and his own considerable expertise. For months, I meticulously tested formulas, tweaking pH levels and protein chains, until I had my weapon perfected. While I was playing the part of the diligent student, I was also laying the intricate groundwork for their financial ruin. With my newfound wealth, I purchased sophisticated spyware and, under the guise of helping my father with a computer issue, installed a keylogger on the family's desktop, the one Evelyn exclusively used for online banking and shopping. Every week, I'd get a neat, detailed report emailed to a dummy account, cataloging every single fraudulent transfer from my college fund to Chloe's credit card, every extravagant purchase, every lie. The evidence mounted, a digital monument to their boundless greed. My most crucial move, however, was reconnecting with my maternal grandmother, Eleanor. Evelyn and my father had systematically pushed her out of my life after my mother's death, feeding me a steady diet of lies that she was unstable, bitter, and didn't want to see me. In truth, they were terrified she would see through their saccharine charade to the rotten core beneath. I found her number in an old leather-bound address book of my mother's that I'd kept hidden. The phone call was one of the hardest things I'd ever had to do. My voice trembled as I dialed, but when she answered, when I heard her kind, familiar voice for the first time in nearly a decade, the words came pouring out. I told her everything. Not about my impossible rebirth, she would have thought I was insane, but about the years of emotional neglect, the financial abuse, the constant, calculated cruelty. I started forwarding her the keylogger reports and copies of bank statements I'd carefully photographed from my father's desk. Eleanor, a retired and still formidable corporate lawyer, was horrified, but to my surprise, not shocked. I always knew there was something wrong with that woman, she'd said, her voice turning to ice. She immediately began building a legal case, quietly and methodically, a sleeping giant waiting for my signal to wake and roar. As junior year bled into senior year, the pieces of my revenge began to slot into their final places. The prom was the all-consuming obsession of our school, and for Chloe, it was to be her coronation. She talked of nothing else. I knew from my first life that she was obsessed with a particular couture designer, a rising star named Alastair Finch, whose gowns were ethereal, unique, and practically unattainable. Using my investment money and an anonymous proxy in Paris, I tracked down the one-of-a-kind silver sample gown from his latest collection, the very dress I knew she would covet, and bought it directly from his showroom. For weeks, Chloe was in a state of high drama, a frenzy of calls and emails trying to acquire the dress she'd seen in a magazine. I let her and Evelyn stew in their panic for a month before I casually mentioned to a mutual friend that I had managed to acquire a designer dress for prom, but that I wasn't sure I'd even wear it. The rumor mill did its work. Within a day, Chloe and Evelyn approached me in the kitchen, their faces a carefully constructed mask of casual inquiry. "Anna, darling," Evelyn began, "we heard the most ridiculous rumor that you have the Alistair Finch gown." I feigned reluctance, then admitted that I did. I led them to my closet and showed it to them. Chloe's gasp was audible. I saw the raw, ugly wanting in her eyes. After a week of them trying to flatter and cajole me into giving it to her, I finally named my price. 5 times what I had paid. It was an obscene amount. Evelyn balked, but Chloe threw the tantrum of a lifetime. My father, unwilling to deny his princess anything that would ensure her happiness and his peace, wrote the check without a second thought, pausing only to lecture me on my selfishness, even as he handed over the money that would fund my first semester of college. I deposited it with a serene smile. The dress was hers. The victory was mine. Then came the centerpiece of my plan. The contacts. The weaponized vanity. I ordered the custom lenses online. My signature violet blue, a perfect match to my own eyes. I wore them to school once for a single day just to make sure Chloe saw them and felt that familiar acidic pang of jealousy. Her eyes had narrowed as I walked past her in the hall, a look I knew so well. I knew then that she would not be able to resist taking them. The night before prom, I placed them on my vanity in their elegant little box, treated them with my perfected, invisible chemical solution, and went out for the evening, leaving my bedroom door conveniently unlocked. It was an irresistible trap for a girl who believed the entire world and everything in it was hers for the taking. The final piece of the puzzle was Mark. In this timeline, I had avoided him like the plague, my polite refusals to his advances only making him more interested. He was, as before, dating Chloe, but I knew from my past life that he was also secretly seeing a fiery, possessive girl from a neighboring school named Jessica. A week before prom, using a burner phone, I sent an anonymous text to Jessica. It was a photo of Mark and Chloe kissing, a picture Chloe had plastered all over her social media. My caption was simple. "He's taking her to prom next Saturday. The grand ballroom at the Ashton Hotel. 8 p.m. thought you should know." The fuse was lit. Prom night arrived, the air in our house thick with the scent of expensive perfume, hairspray, and palpable tension. I wore a simple, elegant black dress, a stark contrast to the glittering, ostentatious spectacle Chloe was making of herself downstairs. My father, Evelyn, and Chloe were a perfect hollow portrait of familial bliss, all beaming smiles and proud pronouncements for the benefit of their social media feeds. My father adjusted Chloe's corsage, his eyes shining with adoration. "You look like a princess, honey, a true princess." He glanced at me as I descended the stairs, his expression flat, dismissive. "You look nice, Anna." They left in a white stretch limousine my father had rented for Chloe and her friends. I drove myself in my modest second-hand car. The 15-minute drive was the calmest I had felt in years. All the anger, all the pain, had been transmuted into a cold, clear purpose. The pieces were all in place. All I had to do now was watch them fall. The gymnasium had been transformed, draped in satin and glittering lights, a poor imitation of a grand ballroom. Chloe was holding court in the center of the dance floor, Mark at her side, her silver dress shimmering like a beacon under the lights. Her eyes, my eyes, were luminous, captivating, drawing compliments from everyone who passed. My father and Evelyn, acting as chaperones, stood by the punch bowl, preening like peacocks. They basked in Chloe's reflected glory, accepting congratulations on their beautiful daughter, as if she were a prize they had personally crafted. I stayed on the periphery, a quiet observer in black, melting into the shadows by the bleachers. I was the director of this play, and I had the best seat in the house. The first hour passed in a blur of pulsing music and teenage awkwardness. The room grew warmer, the air becoming thick and sticky with the heat of hundreds of bodies. I watched Chloe, a silent metronome in my mind, counting down the seconds. At the 2.5-hour mark, precisely on schedule, I saw the first sign. A tiny dark blue line, as thin as a single thread, trickled from the corner of her right eye. She noticed it, dabbing at it with a delicate finger. Her brow furrowed in annoyance under the dim lights. A few minutes later, another line appeared from her left eye. She wiped it away more forcefully this time, a flicker of genuine panic in her expression. She couldn't understand why her waterproof mascara was suddenly failing so spectacularly. People were starting to notice. A girl standing near her whispered to a friend, her hand coming up to hide a smirk. Just as the first seeds of real panic began to sprout on Chloe's face, the second act of my play began with a crash. The main doors to the gymnasium burst open, and Jessica, the spurned girlfriend, stormed in. Her face was a thundercloud of righteous fury, her own prom dress a weaponized sheath of angry red silk. She scanned the crowd, her eyes landing on Mark and Chloe, and marched directly toward them. She slapped Mark so hard the sound cracked through the cavernous room like a gunshot. The music faltered and died as the DJ stared, stunned. "You are cheating on me with her?" Jessica shrieked, her voice dripping with a magnificent theatrical contempt that commanded the attention of every single person in the room. The confrontation was loud, vicious, and exquisitely, gloriously public. Mark stammered pathetic denials. Chloe, utterly blindsided, attempted to play the part of the wronged, noble girlfriend, her voice rising in a theatrical wail. "I can't believe you'd lie to me, Mark," she cried, trying to garner sympathy. Her real tears, hot with rage and humiliation, began to flow. That was the final catalyst. The combination of her tears, the stress, the heat, and the humidity accelerated the chemical reaction exponentially. The carefully constructed protein bonds in my formula broke down completely. Thick, dark, inky blue rivulets began to pour from her eyes. It didn't look like makeup running. It was too thick, too opaque, too pigmented. It looked like she was crying ink, like she was bleeding from her very eyeballs. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The whispers grew into a unified, horrified roar. Someone in the back laughed, a sharp, cruel bark of a sound. Then another. Phones were instantly out, dozens of them, their screens glowing in the dim light as they recorded Chloe's grotesque, surreal meltdown. The blue dye stained her skin, creating bizarre, weeping patterns down her cheeks. She looked monstrous, a beautiful porcelain doll that had cracked open to ooze something foul and black from within. "What's wrong with your eyes?" someone yelled from the safety of the crowd. Chloe touched her face. Her fingers coming away stained a deep, horrifying blue. She stared at her hand, her mind finally comprehending the bizarre reality of the situation. She let out a blood-curdling scream of pure, unadulterated horror that echoed off the gymnasium walls. And at that precise cinematic moment, the main doors opened again. This time, it wasn't a jilted teenager. It was my grandmother, Eleanor, looking every inch the formidable lawyer she was, her silver hair styled, her expression like granite. She was flanked by a man in a sharp, expensive suit and 2 uniformed police officers. The room fell into a stunned, absolute silence. They walked past the gawking students, their footsteps echoing on the polished floor, their eyes fixed on my father and Evelyn, who were frozen by the punch bowl, their faces pale with a dawning, sickening dread. "Richard! Evelyn!" Eleanor's voice was cold and clear, cutting through the thick silence like a shard of ice. "I believe you know why we're here." The lawyer stepped forward, holding a thick, leather-bound file. "Mr. and Mrs. Albright," he began, his voice booming with an authority that brooked no argument. "We have here a warrant to seize your financial records and to place you under arrest. You are being charged with multiple counts of felony fraud, embezzlement, and misappropriation of trust funds belonging to your daughter, Anna Albright." He held up a sheaf of papers for all to see. "We have bank statements, transaction logs from your home computer, sworn affidavits from the bank trustee. It seems you've been funding your rather lavish lifestyle by systematically stealing from a child, from your own daughter." My father's face went slack, all the color draining from it. He looked like a puppet with its strings cut. Evelyn, however, began to bluster, her voice rising to a shrill, desperate pitch. "This is absurd. It's a complete misunderstanding. Anna is a troubled, vindictive girl. She's making this all up." But her words were hollow, pathetic. The lawyer just smiled grimly and handed the file to one of the police officers. The public shaming was absolute, a perfect, inescapable nightmare of their own making. Every parent, every teacher, every pillar of the community whose respect they had so desperately craved was watching them be exposed as common thieves. While the officers read them their rights, their voices dispassionate and routine, Chloe was still sobbing, her face a smeared, ruined mess, the viral spectacle of the night. She looked from her parents being handcuffed to me, standing quietly and serenely by the bleachers. Our eyes met across the crowded, silent room. In that moment of shared stillness, I saw the comprehension dawn in her tear-filled, ink-stained eyes. This was no accident. This was not bad luck. This was a reckoning. This was justice. The 6 months that followed were a quiet, steady reconstruction of a life I should have always had. I moved in with my grandmother, Eleanor, into her beautiful, sun-drenched home, filled not with tension and malice, but with the scent of old books, baking bread, and unconditional love. The legal battle was swift and brutal for my father and Evelyn. The evidence I had so meticulously gathered was irrefutable. They were advised to plead guilty to avoid a much longer, more humiliating public trial. Stripped of their assets and their carefully constructed social standing, they were convicted of fraud and embezzlement. They are now serving 3 years in a low-security prison, a sentence Eleanor's lawyer ensured had no possibility of early parole. The house, my mother's house, was sold as part of the settlement to pay back every stolen cent of my mother's trust and my college fund, with substantial punitive damages added on top. Chloe's fate was, in some ways, more poetic and more devastating than a prison sentence. The images and videos of her crying ink at prom went viral in a matter of hours. She became an instant cruel meme, a local legend for all the wrong reasons. She was nicknamed Calamity Chloe, the girl who cried blue. She was a laughingstock, not just at our school, but across the entire town. Unable to face the relentless public ridicule, she suffered a complete nervous breakdown. She dropped out of school and, upon her parents' incarceration, became a recluse in the small, dingy apartment their few remaining non-seized funds could afford. Her beauty, the only currency she had ever possessed, the weapon she had wielded against me for a decade, was now inextricably linked to a moment of grotesque, unforgettable humiliation. She had wanted my eyes, and in the end, they had utterly destroyed her. As for me, I thrived. Freed from the suffocating weight of my toxic family, my intellect and creativity flourished like a garden after a long winter. I won the state science fair with my project on organic dyes. The irony was not lost on me. Earning a full academic scholarship to my dream university, an Ivy League school on the East Coast. I was no longer the ghost in my own home, the drab little sparrow with broken wings. I was Anna Albright, a survivor, a scholar, a young woman with a future that was incandescently bright and entirely my own. A few weeks before I was due to leave for college, I sat with Eleanor on her wide, sunny porch, sipping iced tea. The official acceptance letter from the university rested in my lap, its crisp paper a tangible symbol of my new life. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves in the ancient oak tree that shaded the lawn. For the first time, my past was not a weight threatening to drown me, but a foundation, scarred and ugly in places, but solid beneath my feet. Are you ready for this? Eleanor asked, her eyes soft with a pride that brought a lump to my throat. I looked out at the peaceful garden, at the vibrant colors of the flowers, and I smiled a genuine, unburdened smile. More than ready, I said. They had tried to bury me, to erase me, to reduce me to nothing. But they didn't realize that in their cruelty, they had planted a seed. They had pushed me into the darkness, but in doing so, had inadvertently given me the chance to grow, to reach for my own light. My victory wasn't just in their downfall, but in my own rebirth. I was happy, I was successful, and most importantly, I was free. Justice, I had learned, was a dish best served with a little bit of chemistry, a lot of patience, and a cold, clear-eyed resolve. They had taken one life from me, but I was going to make damn sure this second one was extraordinary.